epistemology. I'll briefly address that, but I'll also be looking at how both confronted the nature of political life, primarily by reference to a very problematic concept that both of them explored in the idea of the balance of power. Now, like Reid, Hume does pop up in Morgenthau's works. I'm not making the claim that Hume can be read as an influence in the way that, say, Nietzsche has been read and influenced by people like Robert Peterson and Christoph Frey. Myself and Tony Lang have looked at Aristotle and Morgenthau. But there's almost something more tantalizing in the relationship between Hume and Morgenthau. Pardon me. Hume's appearances in Morgenthau's works are limited. He does not feature at all in Politics Among Nations, but he does feature in Morgenthau's perhaps most interesting book, which is Scientific Man versus Power Politics. In this book, Hume is presented as the first of a series of thinkers to realize, in Morgenthau's words, that rationalism is unable to solve the problems of religion and ethics. And this is one of Morgenthau's major preoccupations, is the idea of kind of confronting the ethical and the religious. In many respects, it can be read in contemporary terms as a political theologian. And he sees Hume as an important part of the anti-rationalist moment in modernity. In challenging the claims of rationalism and its successors in Scientific Man versus Power Politics, Morgenthau is clearly an intellectual descendant of Hume. One can draw without too much fear of contradiction a clear sense of identification on behalf of Morgenthau to Hume's project and the isolation of both in the face of orthodoxies of their day. Hume is, for Morgenthau, again, from Scientific Man versus Power Politics, he says, one of the solitary voices raised in protest, a voice crying in the wilderness, if you like, against the rationalistic superstitions that sacrifice the complexities of reality to the purity of reason. It's very much the anti-Kantian element of or maybe perhaps Kantian from another perspective, element of Morgenthau. Morgenthau then goes on to quote proving Hume's skepticism in relation to reason. He says that reason is and ought to be, this is Hume obviously, reason is and ought to be only the slave of the passions and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. This was written, according to Morgenthau, at the moment that rationalism was reaping its philosophic triumphs. For Morgenthau, Hume's importance lies in his identification of the limits of reasoned discourse. Reason is not the source of any person's tenets, but rather the passions. It is vain to expect that any logic which speaks not to the affections will ever engage him to embrace sound principles, writes Hume in an inquiry into the principles of morals. So Morgenthau's project in Scientific Man versus Power Politics is to bring the insights of Hume and his successors in this tradition that Morgenthau identifies as anti-rationalism into the discussion of international relations. Morgenthau then tries to revive a discipline which has forgotten or ignored the power of the anti-rationalist critique. The tragedy of the Humean wing of the political theory in IR for Morgenthau is that, according to Morgenthau, they might as well, in the modern climate of opinion, might well have never written at all, that the triumph of rationalism has eclipsed the power of critique held by Hume and his successors in philosophy and political theory. Hume's essay on the balance of power is also certainly known to Morgenthau. He mentions at least twice in response to pieces by White and Talbot. The significance of this concept to both authors is crucial, I think, and requires detailed investigation as to the balance of power as a dominant motif of international relations. But the way they deal with the balance of power is very interesting. Now, Hume's task, if we examine Hume first and then move to Morgenthau. Hume's task in the essay on the balance of power is to determine whether or not the balance of power is a specifically modern concept. Ultimately, though, the Greek and modern balances have this in common. Whether it was jealous emulation or cautious politics, writes Hume, the effects were alike, and every prevailing power was sure to meet with confederacy against it, and that often composed of its former parents and allies. Such was the power of the logic of the balance of power that it became a policy for the Persian monarchs as well, and what Hume said that the policy maintained Persian power for a century until it collapsed when they momentarily forgot its powerful logic. Hume's attention then very critically turns to the Romans. The Romans did not operate under a logic of the balance of power because they didn't have to. The insights of the balance of power had been lost. He said the Romans never met with any such general combination or confederacy against them as might have been expected from the rapid conquest and declared ambition of Rome. And this is very remarkable for Hume. And he says not only is it remarkable in political practice, it's also remarkable in political theory. He says no record of a contemporary historian or writer called the statesmen of Rhodia and Achaia, not to mention Macedon, to task for these political and strategic errors. This is clear evidence for Hume that the logic of the balance of power was not known at this particular time, a fact that was very advantageous to the Roman power. Only the minor ruler, Hiero of Syracuse, understood the logic of the balance of power, and even though he was a Roman ally, gave support to the Carthaginians. In an important passage from Polybius, he says that Hiero acted with great wisdom and prudence, for that is never on any account to be overlooked, nor ought such a force ever to be thrown into one hand as to incapacitate the neighbouring states from defending their rights against it. So according to Hume, Polybius' analysis gets the core of the modern balance of power. So the ancient and the modern, which he originally counterposes, are actually quite similar. Perhaps even more disturbing for Morgenthau is the failure of the intellectuals to understand the operation of this political logic. And this leads Hume to the conclusion that the balance of power can only gain traction as a policy and theory in periods wherein those powers opposed to the rise of ambitious power, for example, the Spartans in the era of Athens' rise to greatness and Britain during the rise of France in the 17th century, have both the material resources and the strategic nous to understand the necessity to create and maintain a balance of power against the rising power. So the truth of the balance of power may be universal, the possibility of its implementation is quite specific to a particular international scenario. Further examination of the British operation of the balance of power reveals what he says is a kind of failure of the British operation of the balance of power. And he says they're too much affected by passion and ardor. And we begin here to see in his critique of contemporary British use of the balance of power, the limits of the balance of power. But the balance of power is only ever a symptom of a deeper question, deeper issues within political life. What is important for Hume in the balance of power is not the balance of power per se, but the prudence, moderation, and calculation that ought to underpin the logic of those operating. This points to deeper politics than the balance of power, which can either be a symptom of this deeper political reasoning or a symptom of the failure to conceptualize international politics effectively. Attempting to preserve the balance of power for its own sake may not be a good idea. There must be a political purpose behind the effort and a political judgment that directs this purpose. So we move now to Morgenthau on the balance of power. Now for Morgenthau, the balance of power was, in politics and nations, as natural and inevitable an outgrowth of the struggle for power and is as old as political history itself. And while he points to the same passage of Polybius as Hume, he the kind of curious historical observation that we can make of Morgenthau at this time is that the balance of power is perhaps an illusion itself. Contemporary rationalists, he says, operate under a misconception about the nature of politics that asserts that men have a choice between power politics and its necessary outgrowth of the balance of power on the one hand, and a different kind of international relations on the other. For Morgenthau, this is a false dichotomy, as necessity dictates that the balance of power forms the structure and dictate the logic of international relations. At least that's how the balance of power is understood. He says that the stability, supposed stability of the balance of power is volatile and subject to constant change in a situation in which whatever stability the balance of power may achieve must be precarious and subject to perpetual adjustments. This is where he starts to critique the idea of the balance of power. At its most ideal, typical, and mechanical, the balance of power displays a predictable systemic logic. In the classical, if you like, period of modern diplomacy, say, take a date of random 1648, and take another equally, random date 1789. This is the kind of classical period of both diplomacy and also the balance of power. Now, this era was typified by constant betrayals, abrupt changes aside, as each prince jumped from position, making Morgenthau say the 18th century appeared to be particularly unprincipled and avoid moral considerations. Yet for all its moral efficiency, the balance of power at least had, for a certain time at least, the benefit that it preserved Europe from universal monarchy. Now, Morgenthau's critique really begins with the idea that the balance of power reaches its limits of efficiency in the late 18th century. The success of preventing universal monarchy came at the cost of constant warfare and political instability. A system that was promoted as the means by which states could retain their autonomy began in effect to justify their dismemberment with the wholesale elimination of small and medium states, which Morgenthau says was accomplished in the very name of a principle of the balance of power whose chief claim was to serve as to the indispensable means for their preservation as independent individual states. The irony of the balance of power was that not only did the balance of power fail to protect the independence of Poland, but the very principle of territorial compensation to each member for the territorial aggrandizement of any other member brought about the destruction of the Polish state. So the tragedy of Poland was also the tragedy of the balance of power. It marked the limits of the balance of power. It marked the end of the balance of power as an effective principle of strategic logic. Okay, so the breakdown or inversion of the logic of the balance of power allowed Morgenthau to explore three weaknesses of the balance of power. What he calls its uncertainty, taking to Judge Harman's paper, its unreality, and here's interesting, a realist calling the balance of power unreal, and its inadequacy. The weaknesses are epistemological, rooted in the balance of power's origin as a metaphor drawn from early modern mechanics, which, according to Morgenthau, like to picture society and the whole universe as a gigantic mechanism, a machine or clockwork, created and kept in motion by the divine watchmaker. The balance of power, at least in its original formulation in modernity, was a rationalist attempt to provide order to the chaotically interacting forces of early modern Europe. Its efficacy was linked to its specific context. Once the Weltanschauung, in which it emerged, began to wane in the face of the revolutions in America, particularly in France, the presumed logic of the balance of power, at least as it had been understood, began to unravel. So the decline of the balance of power as a strategic and ordering principle in IR begins during the wars of the French Revolution. The revolution effected a massive shift in the idea and operation of the balance of power. France was initially to be subjected to the same treatment as Poland. Knowing this, the revolutionary regime became embroiled in a war predicated on survival, not the maintenance of the balance of power. An altogether different notion of international relations enters at the time of the French Revolution. And this meant that the old certainties of chessboard calculation, even the treacheries involved volte face which were predictable under the old system, well, the old kind of pas de deux of the preceding century was gone. And we returned to a situation of much greater existential crisis within international relations, which was for Morgenthau to continue throughout, despite the hiatus of the 19th century, was to accelerate in the 20th century. The balance of power reverted to something much more protean in the 20th century, the seeds of which were sown at the time of the ideological eruption of the revolution and its playing out across Europe. Once the genie was out of the bottle, even though the genie might rest, it couldn't be put back into the bottle. And a logic of survival, not adjustment, became the predominant motif of international relations. Europe in the 20th century entered an age of uncertainty, as ideologies like liberalism, nationalism, fascism, and communism redrew the map and distorted the logic of the balance of power. Now, even in the classical period, characters like Frederick the Great said that this was an uncertain and problematic way of organizing international relations. But it's at this 20th century that Morgenthau says international relations and the balance of power was now characterized by extreme uncertainty, that the old logic of the balance of power had been eclipsed. He said, for example, that in the period between August 1938 and December 1941, Morgenthau said, no statesman, however great his knowledge, wisdom, and foresight, or his common sense, to use the Rita formulation, could have anticipated all these developments and based his balance of power policies upon them. Now, this uncertainty of the balance of power leads Morgenthau to the conclusion that the balance of power is in fact unreal. The unreality of the balance of power is a consequence of its failure to provide adequate security to those operating within its logic. Like Hume, Morgenthau seeks to go beyond the balance of power and deeper into the nature of political life. For Morgenthau, the ideal principle of the balance of power has been transformed into an ideology by the great powers, and he says, in order to disguise, rationalize, and justify themselves. In other words, these states are acting according to their passions as much as to any pretension to preserve the balance of power. The balance of power for Morgenthau is just a conceptual instrument of power. Far from being a theorist dedicated to the mechanistic balance of power as is often presented in international relations, Morgenthau reveals himself to be a critic of its claims, or the claims of its supporters, to serve as a moderating influence on the conduct of international relations. Such restraint as has been practiced in global politics has been exercised not by a balance of power, or the pursuit of the balance of power, according to Morgenthau, but by the existence of a moral consensus based on intellectual and moral unity, upon whose foundations the balance of power reposes. So it's this idea of intellectual and moral unity upon which the balance of power rests. Now, the temperateness of international politics from 1648 to 1789 and from 1815 to 1914 was not the result of the balance of power, okay, but rather the acceptance among the relevant parties that they were constrained to accept the balance as a moral and political framework for their endeavours. This in turn grew out of the intellectual and moral climate specific to Europe, and this is again a similarity with Hume. Only specific civilizations and cultures can operate a balance of power. It's not a universal truth. The problem for Morgenthau is that the final crisis of Morgenthau's career, and of which the balance of power finds itself affected in his thought, is the revolution, the parallel revolutions of the modern age, explored in his final major work, Science, Servant and Master, which he argues have eroded the very fabric of the intellectual and moral consensus that created the temperateness of international relations between 1648 and 1789. And it's this erosion of the intellectual and moral consensus that left the desire for power unchecked. And the new balance of power, if you like, or that logic of international relations, incapable of fulfilling its function for international stability and national independence. Late modernity with its out-of-control technology, political intemperance and intolerance, and moral blindness, is the latest and most dangerous form of international relations. An age in which the political ethics of the lesser evil, which is one of his major themes as a moral thinker, can gain no traction, and the world was poised on the brink of a nuclear abyss. So the key to engaging with the new dispensation is revealed in Science Servant and Master in three prerequisites. One, to recognize that the nature, the existential nature of politics and international relations is novel. Two, to be conscious of the fact that our modes of thought and action belong to an age that has been left behind by the technological age. So everything we thought we knew about the balance of power, everything we thought we knew about international relations, has to be rethought. This is where I would say we see realism as a critical theory. To close the gap between our obsolescent modes of thought and action and the novel conditions of the technological age by radically changing those modes of thought and action in the light of the novel conditions. This is the third prerequisite. Only thus will we be able to give a sort of power to the infinite potentialities of the technological age for the good of humanity rather than for its destruction. So in essence, Morgenthau's critique of the balance of power, critique of the logic of international relations, points to the extent to which he is an emancipatory figure, as opposed to a sort of Dr. Strangelove figure dedicated to the sort of worship of power. Now, in conclusion, the balance of power as modernity, classical modernity understood it, is for Morgenthau an obsolete concept. The nature of political life has moved on, new thinking is required. This is perhaps Hume and Morgenthau's lasting legacy, not the reification of concepts, but their willingness to analyse and problematize the concepts with which we attempt to provide order to our political existence, and by doing so reveal the deeper political logics and pathologies. I think this is very important, people forget this in Morgenthau. He's very obsessed with the idea of political pathologies that persist beneath the surfaces that the human mind constructs for itself. And this is exactly what the balance of power is for both Hume and Morgenthau. It's an attempt by the human mind to construct order within international relations. Now, in Politics Among Nations, I'm going to conclude with this. There's a very interesting passage on page 7 of the 5th edition revised. He says, deviations from rationality, which are not the result of personal whim or the personal psychopathology of the policymaker, may appear contingent only from the vantage point of rationality, but may themselves be elements in a coherent system of irrationality. The conduct of the Indochina War by the United States suggests that possibility. It is a question worth looking into, whether modern psychology and psychiatry have provided us with conceptual tools which will enable us to construct, as it were, a counter theory of irrational politics, a kind of pathology of international politics. And this is the final phase of Morgenthau's career. This is exactly what he tries to do. And for me, it's also